The thing about advanced galactic civilizations. Marcus Chen had learned over his 2 insufferable years at the Interstellar Academy on Station Theta 9 was that they were all equally terrible at the one thing that mattered, making high school not suck. You'd think species that had mastered faster than light travel, conquered entropy, and figured out how to make cafeteria food that was merely offensive instead of potentially lethal would have cracked the code on teenage education. You'd be wrong. Magnificently, catastrophically wrong. Station Theta 9 orbited a neutron star in the Kepler 442 system, which was the galaxy's polite way of saying, let's put all the potential troublemakers somewhere that makes escape mathematically impossible. The station itself was a marvel of engineering, a massive ring structure that rotated to simulate gravity, though the simulation got a bit creative in the bathrooms, where you sometimes ended up walking on the ceiling. The architects, a species of crystalline beings called the Vreth, insisted this was intentional. A feature, not a bug. Character building. Marcus sat in transdimensional economics, 4th period, watching Professor Kelneth, a blob of sentient gas contained in a force field sphere, drift through an explanation of import-export dynamics across parallel realities. The professor's voice had the consistency of boredom distilled into sound waves. Around Marcus, his classmates displayed various states of consciousness, most of them hovering somewhere between technically awake and astral projection. To his left sat Krieg, a Vrexian, who looked like someone had given a lizard a gym membership and anger management issues. Krieg was currently using his secondary arms to play some sort of holographic game under his desk, the universal student constant that apparently transcended species. Behind Marcus, one of the Luminar students' beings of pure light energy wearing containment suits was literally flickering, which was their equivalent of dozing off. And then there was Vex, sitting 2 rows up, a crystalline who had made it his personal mission to remind everyone that his species had invented half the technology, keeping the station functional. Vex was the kind of being who would correct your pronunciation of words in languages you didn't speak. Marcus had learned to tune him out somewhere around week 3 of freshman year. This was humanity's grand entrance into the galactic community. This was what first contact had led to. 200 years of knowing aliens existed, and Earth had responded by sending its teenagers to a glorified boarding school in space. Marcus represented his entire species every single day, which was a responsibility he carried with all the enthusiasm of someone being asked to explain why humans still used primitive combustion engines when antimatter was readily available. The answer, by the way, was that combustion engines were cooler. Try explaining that to a Vreth who processed information at light speed. Mr. Chen, Professor Kelneth's voice rippled through the classroom, and Marcus realized he'd been staring at the wall panel showing the neutron star's radiation patterns. Perhaps you'd like to explain to the class how quantum tariffs affect cross-dimensional trade agreements. I'd rather not, actually, Marcus said, because 2 years of representing humanity had thoroughly exhausted his supply of caring what aliens thought of his academic performance. The professor's gaseous form shifted colors, cycling through what Marcus had learned was confusion, then mild annoyance, then a sort of resigned acceptance. That was another constant across species. Teachers everywhere had the same reaction to students who had given up. Very well, Kelneth sighed, which was impressive for a being without lungs. Perhaps someone else. The door opened. Now doors opened all the time. This was not news. But this particular door opening carried with it a weight that Marcus felt in his bones, which was strange because the station's artificial gravity generators didn't work that way. Everyone in the classroom turned, even Krieg pausing his game, even the Luminar student snapping back to full brightness. She stood in the doorway, and that was where Marcus's brain started having problems, because she was approximately correct, and stood was technically accurate. But something about both descriptors felt wrong in a way he couldn't articulate. She was humanoid, which made sense. The station's standardized environmental controls meant most students had to be. Dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, uniform fitted correctly, posture neither aggressive nor submissive, but somewhere in that neutral zone teenagers occupied when they were trying not to be noticed. But but her shadow fell at an angle that didn't quite match the overhead lighting. But when she moved, there was a fractional delay, like reality was buffering. But the air around her seemed slightly more present than air had any right to be. "Ah," Professor Kelneth said, and his voice carried an emotion Marcus had never heard from him before. "Was that nervousness? Class, we have a transfer student. Please introduce yourself." The girl's eyes swept across the room. They were brown. Definitely brown. Except when they weren't, for just a microsecond, appearing to contain depths that made Marcus's head hurt. "Designation Row 7. She said, then paused. "I mean, call me Row." Her voice was normal. Completely, utterly normal. Which was somehow the most disturbing thing about her, because nothing else was. "Row," the professor repeated, his gaseous form shifting to a pale yellow. "Yes, well, please take a seat. We have one available next to Mr. Chen." Of course, they did. Of course the universe would decide that the weird new student who made Marcus's hindbrain scream danger in 12 different languages would sit right next to him. That was just how his luck worked. Row walked down the aisle. Each step was normal. Each step was perfectly ordinary. Each step left no footprints but somehow left an impression, like she was too real, too present, existing in 3 dimensions more forcefully than anything else in the room. She sat down. The chair made the normal sound chairs made. Her bag hit the floor with an appropriate thud. She pulled out a notebook that had too many pages for its thickness. Marcus was sure of it, though he couldn't explain how he knew. "Hi," Marcus said, because someone had to say something, and everyone else seemed to have developed a sudden fascination with their own desks. Row turned to look at him. Her eyes were definitely brown again. "Hello." "Marcus. Human. I know." That was when he noticed her desk was warping, not dramatically. Not in any way that screamed for attention. But the surface, which had been flat synthetic composite 5 seconds ago, was now developing shallow curves, like the molecular bonds were reconsidering their commitment to solid-state physics. "Is your desk melting?" Marcus whispered. Row looked down. The curves flattened. The desk returned to being just a desk, though Marcus swore he saw it shudder slightly in the process. "No," she said. "Right? Cool. Just checking." Professor Kelneth had resumed his lecture, though his voice carried a tremor that hadn't been there before. Something about dimensional stability and trade route security, which was either deeply relevant or deeply ironic. Marcus couldn't tell which. Behind them, Vex made a sound like crystals grinding. "Temporal inconsistencies," he hissed to his neighbor, another crystalline named Thex. "I'm detecting temporal inconsistencies." "She's creating them just by existing. Maybe your senses are malfunctioning," Thex replied, but he didn't sound convinced. Marcus risked another glance at Row. She was taking notes, her handwriting neat and precise, forming words in standard galactic script that somehow looked wrong despite being technically perfect. It was like watching someone who had learned to write by studying videos, but had never actually held a pen before. The period dragged on. Marcus tried to focus on the lecture. He failed. Instead, he cataloged the small wrongnesses accumulating around Row like flies around something dead. Her pen existed in her hand, then it was in her other hand. No movement between states, just a discontinuity. The light above their desk flickered, but only above their desk, and only in a frequency that made Marcus's eyes water. When she breathed, the air moved wrong. It flowed toward her on the inhale but didn't flow back on the exhale, disappearing somewhere that air wasn't supposed to go. And through it all, she sat there, perfectly calm, perfectly still, perfectly wrong. The bell rang. Students evacuated the classroom with the speed usually reserved for fire drills. Even Professor Kelneth seemed to deflate with relief, his gaseous form dispersing slightly before he caught himself and maintained professional cohesion. Marcus stood. Rose stood. They walked toward the cafeteria in silence, though Marcus wasn't sure why he was walking with her. Maybe because everyone else was actively avoiding her, creating a bubble of empty space in the crowded hallway. Maybe because he was an idiot. Probably that second one. The cafeteria was a marvel of xenocultural compromise, which meant it was terrible in ways that transcended any single species' cuisine. The food synthesizers tried their best to accommodate everyone from methane breathers to lithium digesters, resulting in a menu that would make anyone from any planet sad. Marcus grabbed something that claimed to be Earth-style protein composite and immediately regretted it. Ro approached the synthesizer, stared at the menu for exactly 3 seconds, and ordered water. Just water. Nothing else. They ended up at a table near the observation windows, which showed the neutron star's accretion disk in all its terrifying glory. Marcus ate his protein composite. Rose stared at her water. So, Marcus said, "Transfer student. Where from?" "Classified." "Species?" "Classified." "Favorite color?" Rose's head tilted 15 degrees. "Is that relevant?" "Just making conversation. It's this thing humans do when sitting with other humans in awkward silence." "I'm not human." "Yeah. I picked up on that." She watched him eat for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she picked up her water. The glass contained approximately 250 milliliters of liquid. She drank. The glass still contained 250 milliliters of liquid. The water level hadn't changed, but she definitely swallowed. Marcus decided not to comment. Around them, other students whispered. Marcus caught fragments. "Don't know what she is. Security clearance required for her file. Heard she's some kind of weapon. That's ridiculous." That last one came from a Luminar student, spoken with the kind of forced confidence people used when trying to convince themselves of something. "Do you ever eat?" Marcus asked. "When required." "And when is it required?" "When maintaining appearances is more important than energy conservation." That was not a normal answer. That was an answer that suggested eating was a performance rather than a biological necessity. Marcus filed that information away under things that should concern me but probably won't until it's too late. His tablet buzzed. Schedule update. Next period. Advanced Physics with Professor Yurthan, a Vreth who had the personality of a particularly aggressive textbook. The class was held in Lab 7, which had reinforced walls because physics experiments at the galactic level tended to get energetic. "What's your next class?" he asked Ro. She pulled out her schedule. Advanced Physics. Lab 7, cool. Same. They walked together, Marcus unable to shake the feeling that he was escorting something dangerous, wearing the skin of something benign. The hallways were crowded, students flowing between classes in the organized chaos that transcended species. A group of Rexians pushed past, Krieg among them, his reptilian face twisted in the universal expression of teenage arrogance. Lab 7 was a wide space filled with experimental equipment that looked impressive and dangerous in equal measure. Professor Yurthan stood at the front, his crystalline body refracting the overhead lights into rainbow patterns across the walls. Unlike Professor Kelnath, Yurthan didn't do nervous. Yurthan did stern, humorless, and occasionally terrifying. "Seats," Yurthan commanded, his voice resonating through the crystal lattice of his body. Marcus headed toward his usual spot near the back. Ro followed. They Saturday. The desk didn't warp this time, which Marcus took as a good sign. Maybe she was learning to control whatever she was doing. Or maybe the desks in Lab 7 were reinforced against reality distortions. Hard to say. "Today," Yurthan began, "we will discuss entropic decay and its applications in faster-than-light travel. Pay attention. This will be on your examination, and I do not curve grades for students who fail to grasp basic universal constants." The lecture began. Marcus tried to follow along, he really did. But physics was hard enough when reality cooperated. When reality was sitting next to you and occasionally making the laws of thermodynamics cry, paying attention became significantly more challenging. Halfway through the period, Krieg raised one of his primary hands. "Professor, I have a question." "Make it relevant." Yurthan replied, "What happens when you introduce a foreign variable into a closed entropic system?" Yurthan's crystalline form brightened, a sign he was pleased. "An excellent question. The system attempts to accommodate the variable while maintaining equilibrium. If the variable is incompatible, the system breaks down. Catastrophically. In most cases." Krieg smiled, showing far too many teeth. He turned to look directly at Ro. Like introducing something that doesn't belong into a stable environment. Oh, no. Marcus knew that tone. That was the tone of a bully who'd found a target and thought he was being clever. That's not a physics question, Marcus said. Wasn't asking you, human. Then ask a real question or shut up. The classroom went quiet. You didn't provoke Rexians. They were stronger, faster, and had a cultural attitude toward violence that made Earth's roughest neighborhoods look civilized. But Marcus was tired, frustrated, and sitting next to something that terrified him on a molecular level. He didn't have bandwidth left for Krieg's nonsense. Krieg stood. His chair scraped backward with a metallic shriek. You want to say that again? Mr. Krieg, Mr. Chen, sit down. You're then ordered, but there was uncertainty in his voice. The professor was calculating whether intervening would make things worse. Ro stood. She didn't stand quickly. She didn't stand threateningly. She just stood, rising from her chair with the smooth motion of someone who'd practiced standing 10,000 times and knew exactly how it worked. Please sit down, she said to Krieg. Her voice was calm, measured, completely empty of emotion. Or what? Krieg laughed. You gonna make me, new girl? That was when Marcus noticed the colors were wrong. Not dramatically wrong, not in any way that screamed for attention. But the fluorescent lights overhead were producing shades that didn't exist in the normal visible spectrum. The walls were shifting through hues that Marcus's eyes couldn't quite process. And someone's tablet notification, a student's cough, the hum of the ventilation system were all arriving at his ears slightly before they happened. Ro was still standing, still calm, still empty. Please, she repeated, sit down. Krieg took a step forward. He was posturing, flexing, doing the whole aggressive display that Vrexians thought made them look tough. In reality, it made them look like lizards having a tantrum, but nobody had the heart to tell them. Make me. Ro tilted her head. 15 degrees. Exactly 15 degrees. And Marcus realized with growing horror that he'd seen her make that exact gesture before. It wasn't thoughtful consideration. It was a targeting calculation. Warning, she said, though Marcus wasn't sure if she was talking to Krieg or herself. Emotional escalation detected. Defensive protocols engaging. Recommend immediate de-escalation. What are you talking about? Krieg laughed, but it sounded forced. I am talking, Rose said slowly, about the fact that you are making a tactical error. The walls began to melt. Not like ice melting. Not like metal under a torch. The walls began to melt like reality was a painting, and someone had spilled solvent on it. The molecular bonds that held the reinforced alloy together simply stopped caring. They gave up. They looked at the concept of solid matter and decided it was too much work. The floor followed, the ceiling joined in. Within 3 seconds, Lab 7 stopped being a room and started being a suggestion. Students screamed. Some ran for the door, which was also melting, becoming less of a barrier and more of a decorative notion. Others froze, their survival instincts overwhelmed by the sheer impossibility of what they were witnessing. Professor Yurthen's crystalline body flickered, cycling through colors that indicated confusion, alarm, and the Vreth equivalent of this was not covered in my teaching certification. Rose stood at the center of it all, perfectly calm, perfectly still, perfectly wrong. The melting radius expanded outward from her position at a steady rate 1 meter every 2 seconds. Marcus's brain calculated helplessly. At this rate, the entire lab would be gone in 30 seconds, the adjacent sections in 45. The whole station in Marcus didn't let himself finish that math. Stop, he yelled, though his voice felt small against the sound of reality having a breakdown. Ro didn't stop. Her eyes were no longer brown. They were something else, something that hurt to look at. Depths that contained distances that shouldn't fit inside a skull. Threat assessment incomplete, she said, but her voice was layered now, multiple frequencies speaking in harmony. Defensive parameters remain active. Cannot disengage until threat neutralized. Krieg wasn't laughing anymore. He was backing away, his forearms held up in the universal gesture of surrender. I wasn't going to. You initiated hostile interaction. Rowe stated. Probability of violence, 73%. Defensive action authorized. The walls weren't just melting now. They were forgetting. Forgetting they'd ever been walls. Forgetting the basic physical laws that made walls possible. Marcus could see through them. No, not through them. Into them. Into the spaces between atoms, where quantum mechanics did its thing. Except now those spaces were expanding, growing, becoming vast emptiness where solid matter used to be. A fire alarm activated, which was optimistic considering fire required oxygen and matter and other concepts that were currently up for debate. Emergency lights strobed. Somewhere, an automated system was trying to seal the lab, which was like trying to seal a thought. Good luck with that, automation. Marcus made a decision. A stupid decision. The kind of decision that would probably get him killed or worse. But he was already tired of being the human representative, tired of following rules, tired of everything being complicated. He walked toward Rowe. Don't, someone yelled behind him. Might have been Vex, hard to tell. Sound was getting weird, arriving from directions that didn't exist. Marcus Chen. Professor Yerthen's voice crackled. Stand down immediately. Marcus ignored them. He walked through the melting reality, feeling the wrongness wash over him like a wave of statistical impossibilities. His skin tingled, his bones hummed, his DNA briefly considered whether being DNA was really worth the effort. He stopped 2 meters from Rowe, close enough to talk, far enough to run if this went badly. Hey, he said. Rowe's multi-frequency voice responded, move away from the defensive perimeter. Your safety cannot be guaranteed. Yeah, I figured. But here's the thing, Marcus took a breath. You're not actually trying to hurt anyone, are you? Those impossible eyes focused on him. He felt seen in a way that went beyond visual observation. She was seeing him on frequencies humans didn't even have names for. Incorrect. I am a defensive platform. Neutralizing threats is primary function. Nah, Marcus said, surprised by how calm he sounded. If that was true, Krieg would already be gone. You're not neutralizing, you're warning. Big difference. The melting slowed. Just slightly. Just enough to notice. I am a weapon, Rowe said, and for the first time, her voice carried something other than empty calm. Was that confusion? Weapons destroy. I am destroying. You're making a point, Marcus corrected. Destroying would be faster. Cleaner. This? He gestured at the melting walls. This is dramatic. This is a show. This is a scared teenager who doesn't know how to make someone back off without proving she's dangerous. Silence. The kind of silence that was full of calculations, risk assessments, probability matrices running through processing power Marcus couldn't imagine. I am not a teenager, Rowe said finally. I am designation Row 7. Strategic Reality Manipulation Platform, Generation 4. Created by Terran Military Research Division for asymmetric warfare applications. Oh no. Humans made her. Of course humans made her. Because humanity's response to joining the galactic community and finding out they were technologically behind wasn't to catch up. It was to cheat. It was to look at the laws of physics and say, yeah, but what if we just didn't? Marcus laughed. He couldn't help it. It was either laugh or cry, and laughing seemed more productive. We weaponized a teenager, he said. We looked at conventional warfare, decided that was too boring, and made a weapon that could theoretically end reality. And then let me guess someone thought it would be a great idea to field test her at a high school. Rowe's eyes flickered. Brown again. Just for a moment. Infiltration and observation mission. Assess multi-species integration programs. Identify potential tactical advantages. Gather intelligence. And maybe learn to be less of a walking apocalypse. That was not in the mission parameters. Bet it wasn't. Marcus took a step closer. The tingling in his skin increased. But you know what? Those mission parameters didn't account for Krieg being an idiot. They didn't account for someone pushing your buttons. They didn't account for you being stuck in a classroom full of kids who are all just trying to survive high school. I do not have buttons. Everyone has buttons. Marcus said. That's like, The defining feature of being conscious. Having buttons people can push. Being affected by stuff. Caring about things. The melting had stopped. The walls were still wrong. They remembered being walls, but they were fuzzy on the details, but they weren't getting worse. That seemed like progress. I do not care, Rose said, but her voice was single frequency again. Normal. Human. Caring is inefficient. Yeah. Well, efficiency is overrated. Take it from someone whose species still uses combustion engines. He held out his hand. Just that. Just an open palm, the universal gesture that predated language, that transcended species. An offer. A choice. Rose stared at his hand for approximately 3 seconds. Then, slowly, carefully, she reached out and took it. Her hand was warm, solid, real. Just a hand. Nothing more. The walls remembered how to be walls. The floor returned to being floor. The ceiling stopped having an existential crisis. Lab 7 reconstructed itself, molecular bonds reaffirming their commitment to solid-state physics, reality snapping back like a rubber band that had been stretched too far. Students gasped. Professor Ure then made a sound like crystals rearranging in relief. Krieg was curled in the corner, all 4 arms wrapped around himself, making small whimpering noises. Marcus was still holding Rose's hand. So, he said, that was exciting. I apologize for the disruption, Rose said, her voice small. Uncertain. Very, very young. That was not supposed to happen. You think? I am still learning to regulate emotional responses. The defensive protocols are automatic. When I feel threatened, they activate. I cannot always control them. Yeah, Marcus said gently. That's called being a teenager. Welcome to the club. It's terrible here. Emergency teams arrived. Security personnel in full hazmat suits, scanning for radiation, dimensional fractures, temporal anomalies, and probably existential threats. They surrounded Roe, weapons drawn but not aimed, clearly unsure whether they were dealing with a student or a natural disaster. Stand down. A voice crackled through their communicators. Admiral Zhang, the human representative on the station's oversight committee. Row 7. Respond to command override. Rose's hand tightened on Marcus's. Just slightly. Just enough to be noticeable. Responding, she said, all systems nominal. Defensive protocols disengaged. No casualties reported. You are to report to containment level 7 immediately. Understood. She let go of Marcus's hand. The warmth faded. She walked toward the security team with that same smooth, practiced motion, every step measured, every gesture deliberate. But just before she left, she turned back. Thank you, she said to Marcus, for treating me like a person instead of a weapon. You're welcome, Marcus replied, though his brain was still catching up to everything that had happened. For what it's worth, I think you're both. And that's okay. She smiled. It was small, brief, possibly the first genuine smile she'd ever made. Then she was gone, escorted away by security personnel who looked like they were expecting her to explode at any moment. Professor Urithen's voice cut through the chaos. Class dismissed, forever. I am retiring, effective immediately. Teaching does not pay enough for this. Marcus couldn't argue with that logic. The next 2 weeks were a bureaucratic nightmare. Forms in 17 languages, interviews with security personnel from 5 different species. Psychological evaluations to make sure Marcus wasn't suffering from reality distortion trauma. He passed. Barely, mostly because the psychologist, a luminar named Vextara, was more interested in how humans could remain sane while living with Row 7 than whether Marcus specifically was traumatized. The story came out in pieces. Row 7 wasn't the first reality manipulation platform. She was the 4th generation, each version more sophisticated, more powerful, more dangerous. The first 3 had been decommissioned after they'd proven unstable. Row was supposed to be different, better, more controlled. She wasn't. But she was close enough that the military had decided to field test her in the most controlled environment they could think of, a high school. The theory was that social interaction would teach her to regulate her responses, to understand appropriate force escalation, to be more than just a weapon. The theory had some problems. Specifically, the theory didn't account for teenagers being terrible. But here was the interesting part. The test was still running. Row 7 hadn't been decommissioned. She hadn't been locked away in containment. After 2 weeks of debriefing, evaluation, and probably more paperwork than should exist in any sane universe, she was reassigned. Back to the Interstellar Academy. Back to Station Theta 9. Back to Trans-Dimensional Economics, 4th period. With Professor Kelneth, who had not retired despite probably wanting to, Marcus walked into class on Monday morning and found Rose sitting at the desk next to his. She was writing in her notebook, still too many pages for its thickness. Still slightly wrong, but stable. The desk wasn't melting. The walls weren't forgetting themselves. Reality had agreed to cooperate, at least for now. "Hey," Marcus said, sitting down. "Hello," Rose replied. Her eyes were brown, definitely brown. No depths, no distances, just brown. "How was containment level 7? "Boring. They ran many tests. All systems functioned within acceptable parameters." "Cool. Did they teach you not to melt classrooms when someone's being a jerk?" "They recommended alternative conflict resolution strategies. Such as walking away, ignoring provocation, reporting incidents to appropriate authority figures." "But," Rose's lips quirked, just slightly. "Just enough. But sometimes melting a little bit of wall is faster." Marcus laughed. Around them, other students filed in, giving Roe a wider berth than before but not evacuating entirely. Vex sat in his usual spot, though he'd positioned himself farther from Roe than previously. Krieg hadn't returned to the academy. Apparently, he'd transferred to a different station, one without reality-warping weapons, pretending to be teenagers. Professor Kelneth began the lecture, his gaseous form a steady orange that indicated calm acceptance, or possibly resignation. Hard to tell with sentient gas. Marcus pulled out his tablet, preparing to take notes he wouldn't read. Beside him, Rose did the same. Her pen existed in her hand, stayed in her hand, behaved like a normal pen. "Progress." "Marcus," she said quietly, not looking up from her notes. "Yeah? Thank you for what you said. In Lab 7. "Which part?" "The part about being both a person and a weapon. About that being okay." Marcus considered his response. Around them, Professor Kelneth was explaining something about quantum tariffs and dimensional stability. Nobody was paying attention. That was also a constant across species. "You know what the funny thing is?" Marcus said finally. "Humanity spent 200 years preparing for first contact. Building weapons, training soldiers, creating contingencies, and we did join the galactic community eventually. We did make our mark, but not through conquest or domination. How then? We weaponized everything, including high school. We looked at education and thought, yeah, but what if it was also a field test for reality-ending technology? That's the most human thing I can imagine." Rose tilted her head. 15 degrees. "Is that a good thing?" "Honestly, no idea. But it's definitely a thing." Marcus grinned. "Welcome to humanity. We're really good at taking concepts that should never meet and forcing them together to see what happens. Sometimes we get combustion engines. Sometimes we get you. I remain uncertain whether I represent progress. Join the club. Every teenager in history has felt that way. Turns out feeling like you might be a mistake is just part of being 17. I am technically 3 years old. Yeah, but you've got the emotional stability of a teenager, so I'm counting it." They sat in silence for a moment, pretending to pay attention to the lecture. Outside the observation windows, the neutron star continued its rotation, indifferent to the small dramas playing out on Station Theta 9. The galaxy turned, the universe expanded, and in one classroom, a human boy and a reality-warping weapon tried to figure out how to pass economics. The thing about advanced galactic civilizations, Marcus had learned, was that they were all equally terrible at the one thing that mattered. But maybe that was okay. Maybe the point wasn't to figure everything out, Maybe the point was to keep trying, keep adapting, keep forcing incompatible concepts together, and hoping for the best. That, at least, was very human. Ro's notebook caught his eye. She was doodling in the margins small geometric patterns that probably represented complex mathematical formulae, but looked like the kind of thing any bored student might draw. She noticed him looking and quickly covered the page with her hand. "It helps me focus," she said defensively. "No judgment. My notebooks are like 80% doodles, 20% actual notes. That seems inefficient. Welcome to humanity. We specialize in inefficiency." Professor Kelneth droned on. Students dozed. The universe continued not caring. And Marcus Chen, representative of humanity, sat next to a walking violation of thermodynamics and thought about how strange his life had become. Strange, but not bad. Definitely weird. Occasionally terrifying. But not bad. That was something, at least. As the bell rang and students filed out, Marcus gathered his things slowly. Ro did the same, her movements still practiced, still deliberate, but with a tiny bit less precision than before. She was learning to be imperfect. That was probably progress. "Same time tomorrow?" Marcus asked. "I am assigned to this class for the remainder of the semester. So yes, same time tomorrow." "Cool. Try not to melt anything in the meantime. I will attempt to maintain material stability." They walked toward the cafeteria, two students in a crowd of many, one human and one weapon, both trying to figure out how to be teenagers in a galaxy that had stopped being surprised by anything. The hallways were crowded. The food would be terrible. Reality would probably continue cooperating, at least until the next time someone pushed the wrong buttons.